Well, good afternoon, Greg. Welcome to what makes the 14th edition of the High Ground. It's not what it's like with you at the moment. It's festeringly hot here.
It's hot here too. I'm impressed that you're counting. I'm too old to count anymore. Stop doing that.
No, I remember that because when the 13 came out, I wasn't sure we could call it 13. I was
Ooh,
superstitious or not.
I'm glad you didn't tell me.
Yeah, exactly. So this week's episode, we're going to focus on weapons, largely because in Ukraine we've given away massive amounts of our stockpiles. A gun is useless unless you've got bullets available for it. And the question is, we've got lots of our weapons like Storm Shadow, we're 30 years old. Do we replace them? And what are we replacing them with? Do we do quantity or quality? And I think it's probably worth us just navigating through how we got to today because, back in the sort of Cold War, when you and I first served, it was all really dumb weapons, wasn't it? It was free-fall weapons. It was retard weapons where you drop the £1,000. They're very cheap. £1,000, I think, was about £3,000. So not expensive. You're in the same £1,000 largely since the Second World War, the Lancasters with their 1,000 bomber raids and everything. And we had to deliver them all at low level, which was pretty interesting. I think for me, the obvious one that happened probably in your time was the JP-233 when that low level did, and that looked like Operation Certain Death because you had to fly along on an enemy airfield at a certain height at a certain speed. And whilst the weapon was pretty, my goodness, was that target practice? Did you ever fire that sort of weapon? And what do people feel about having to go across enemy airfields at
Yeah,
straight level?
I never had to drop that one. I was on my exchange with the Canadians when we were dropping those, and we only ever dropped them once, of course, during the Gulf War. But it's interesting because that was a bespoke weapon for a bespoke task. It was designed for one target and one target only, which was runways. And the belief that we had in the Cold War is that taking out individual aircraft would have taken too long, and we'd have lost too many people doing it. That the best way to shut the Russian Soviet Air Force down was to confine it to barracks by basically taking all the runways out. And it was a clever weapon. It did about 60 craters. If you had 60 craters, the full length of the runway, about every sort of 100 feet or so, and then mines all around it. So if anyone went to fill the holes in, they couldn't. So it was a very, very bespoke weapon. But you're right, the others that we had were there was only two. There was the £1,000 bomb and the BL-755 cluster weapon, which was probably a bit more your bread and butter because that was an anti-armor, sort of anti-army weapon.
Yeah, so we used to run around with that, up to seven of those things, but largely because it's really difficult to hit a tank. I think one of the things I hadn't appreciated till you fly the jets is that if you're trying to drop a bomb by pressing the pickle button on the stick exactly at the right moment, if you look at, we weren't traveling as fast as you guys, but if you look at 500 miles an hour, let's call it 600 for the math's sake, you're traveling 1,000 foot a second. So if you're hitting that stopwatch to a 20th of a second, you get within 50 feet. Well, even that's probably not enough. And if I could challenge anybody listening to this podcast, could you actually stop your stopwatch to a 20th of a second? So, you and I would regularly go back and try and hone our skills on the ranges, wouldn't we, with our 3 kilogram terror weapons? But how often did you do manual deliveries, or did you have the guy in the back doing radar and all this sort of stuff to try and get it accurate?
Yeah, we did a bit of both. If you could do it manually if you needed to. For the Tornado, one of the benefits was, in theory, we could do this in poor weather, i.e. no visibility, and at night. And that did require it to be done automatically. So what you needed was another means to find the target than your eyeball, which was a radar in those days. So the NAVs used to spend quite a lot of time and effort finding things that would be radar significant, that would then guide you to the target. And then you'd literally drop on their mark and you'd hope that it was within, the requisite distance. And they got pretty good at it. Getting within 50 to 80 feet was normal in any weather without seeing the target. Now, that's close enough with a £1,000 weapon because of the explosion. You and I could start drawing triangles here about why did we drop them from low level? The primary reason was the weather in Germany was such that actually you would rarely see a target from height. And secondly, you had to be low because you were going to deliver the weapon close to the target because it was only going to go as fast as you were traveling because of gravity. So, and you had to be at low level, and that meant you didn't see the target till quite late. And if you're flying, as you and I would have been doing at 100 feet, probably a bit lower in a war if we could do it. Trying to stay away from the stuff coming at you, you are going to see that target extremely late. And as you say, 1,000 feet a second. I mean, the way I used to describe it to people is if you put 3 football pitches end to end, you go from the end of one to the end of the third one in a second. And during that second, you've got to pick the right moment to press that button and all the bits and pieces to work, bomb come off, da 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 da. It's there's science, but yeah, it was quite an art form, wasn't it?
It was, and you talk about the sort of how high we'd fly around. I mean, the guys in the desert when they were doing the JP233, obviously you're flying as low as you dare. But interestingly, most of the weapons we delivered, you had to be above a minimum height, didn't you? Otherwise, the bomb would not actually arm in time. And part of it was also to make sure, particularly the retard weapons, that you had enough distance to get away from the bomb before it impacted and exploded. So you had to climb often. And I think Red Flag was one of the exercises we did regularly, where day one you'd all be shot to hell and you wouldn't survive because you were desperately trying to evade all of the enemy radars getting in there. And then largely you had no capacity to get the bomb off exactly the right place. But by the end of 2 weeks, you were now on top of it and it was working. Did you guys do OLF, visual OLF very often then? Or did you largely... Okay.
Yeah, we used to disappear off to Goose Bay in Newfoundland, Canada, or occasionally in the UK. But the best low flying we ever did was probably in Canada. It was you could do pretty much what you needed to do at 100 feet for the best part of an hour. I mean, you were worn out by the end of it. But you're right about the fuses. I mean, the fuses were there for 2 reasons. One, you didn't want it to arm too quickly because if it went off literally as it came off the aircraft, then now you're in trouble. You don't want that to happen, so you need a bit of separation of the weapon from the aeroplane, and then obviously it goes bang, and you don't really want it going bang underneath you when you're at 100 feet. So as you know, the aeroplanes had effectively a parachute, which retarded the weapon and slowed it down so it went bang behind you. But I remember a story from the Falklands War. The BL-755s, they didn't drop many, but the ones that they dropped, they were going duds because they were dropping them at 50, 60, 70 feet because they weren't arming. They were just landing, completely unarmed. And there's a vane on the front that used to turn 12 times. I remember this in my days. And they were pre-turning them by a half a dozen clicks so that it could arm faster and therefore they could drop it lower. So, yeah, tricks you can play, but the likelihood, I don't know many people know this, but when we drop weapons in wartime, we're dropping them at 10 to the minus 3 calculation of risk to you as your own aircraft. So there's a 1 in 1,000 chance every time you drop a bomb of you going bang. Now, I happen to think we're super safe. It doesn't seem to happen that often, but yeah, we are taking a risk that the weapon might cause damage to us just as much as it might cause damage to the bad guy.
Well, that risk is also really fascinating because I remember, as you said, in Germany when the weather was really poor, we had to go in at low level because you just wouldn't see the target otherwise. But there were strict rules as exist today as they existed then. Was it 5.5 kilometers viz and about 200?
We're going to show ourselves up here for not knowing. It was 5Ks. I remember it well. 5Ks, but sometimes it was 2.5 Ks that way and 2.5 Ks that way.
That was exactly my point. Is that the first trip I ever did in Germany, I was the back end of a 4-shipper Harriers, and I'd been instructing for 2.5 years, so I was anally retentive about the rules. And of course, we got airborne. It wasn't 5Ks; it was 2,000 meters, if that. Back end of a 4-ship, there were jets everywhere. F-16s flying the opposite way and everything. Landed at the end of the trip with my eyes out on the stalls. And of course, any safety points, the leader went, and I sort of put my hand up and went, that visibility. And the whole room sort of rounded on me, Johnny Wet Pants, that we're going to war tomorrow. We're not going to not go to war because the weather isn't good enough. And it was very much that sense of, yes, the rules are there, but we are going to operate, just because the weather's pretty bad, we are still going to have to go and do it. So you have to manage that risk. And I do think it's very different today, that approach to, now we did kill a lot of people, to be brutally honest, a lot of training accidents as well. But yeah, there was a different approach to risk, wasn't there?
Yeah, it was pretty hardcore. And as you say, we lost people in pushing those rules to their limits and sometimes beyond. But you're right, at the time, that was a sort of acceptable norm because of the threat and the proximity of that threat. It could be today or tonight, and therefore you had to be ready. Now, that's a mindset, of course. I'm not condoning breaking the rules, but in order to train in pretty shitty weather for 4 or 5 months of the year, you had to liberally apply the rules, shall we say?
Yeah, but also, I mean, I think nearly all the targets we were going against, you had to overfly them. And you look in hindsight, you go, okay, you had to try and achieve the element of surprise. You had to go at low level to evade the enemy radars. If something's worth attacking, it's probably worth defending. So a lot of these targets, it felt like it was a bit of Operation Certain Death. We haven't talked, I mean, obviously we also had rockets, didn't we? CRV-7 rockets and SNEB rockets. But to deliver those, you had to pop and expose yourself to enemy and then fly straight and level down towards the target, well, down towards the target. And that, again, made you very vulnerable. And, of course, guns. Now, we didn't have a gun on the GR57. You had a gun on the Tornado.
Was that we had a couple of guns. A couple of Mausers, 27 mil bizarrely. But, they were pretty... Well, they used to fire relatively accurately. I can't remember the rate of fire now. I think it was anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 rounds a minute. But on my tour on the F-18, it was the Gao Gatling, and that was 6,000 rounds a minute. That was a beast. And a gun has its uses, particularly actually in peacetime, bizarrely. But you and I, of course, had quite different targets. Your job was to go and take on the Russian army as it was pouring across the border, literally not far away from where you were based. So yours was definitely a war of survival. The targets we had were a bit deeper into East Germany that were trying to hit some of the deeper targets. So we had different priorities, but we both faced, shark-infested custard, that's for sure.
Yeah, and the only other standoff I could think of, really, I'm trying to think of weapons that we might have used, but we just used to toss 1,000-pound bombs in. So you'd hammer it at low level, pull back on the stick, and then throw this bomb on a sort of parabola. And it always struck me as the time, you could miss it by miles, the target. In fact, when we did it on ranges, it was remarkably accurate. You wouldn't want to hit the target, but if you did an airburst over the top of it. But did you have any other standoff weapons that you were using, or was it pretty much just...
Yeah, not at the time. Exactly the same as you. We'd loft 1,000-pounders. We got pretty good at it, to be fair, particularly with the nav doing the sort of marking. So you knew that the kit knew where the target was. It then did a calculation as you pulled up, and you just committed the bomb. And the bomb went when it knew it was time to go, and flew best part of 3 miles. We used to get within 100 feet every time. I mean, if you got outside 100 feet, you were disappointed, but you would certainly be well within 200 feet. Now, we used to drop the nuclear weapon exactly the same way. And funnily enough, 100-foot, 200-foot miss distance doesn't matter with one of those. And the beauty of that is you could already be turning and disappearing the other way whilst the bomb went off behind you. Although with a nuclear bomb, that was quite a big bang, clearly. But loft and toss bombing in the dark or in bad weather, which we used to do as well, was emotional. That's for sure.
Yeah, and they always used to worry about the recoveries, didn't they? The number of people who would try and get down to low level very quickly afterwards would then scare themselves. We tended to use toss as something to distract the enemy. So you'd come in, one jet would come in from a completely different direction, toss a bomb from a long way out, because as soon as he exposed himself to the radar, he'd attract attention. He'd immediately be doing evasive maneuvers whilst these bombs were in the air. They may not hit the target, but they would distract the enemy. And then these explosions would go off. And then very shortly afterwards, we would end up rushing in, trying to pick up the pieces. But it was, it just felt a very vulnerable time. It was, we hoped we'd never have to do it, but we were going to be vulnerable.
Well, a couple of our mates, John Peters and John Nichol, the famous Tornado shootdown, I mean, they were doing exactly that when they were shot down. The enemy gets a vote, and when you pop up to chuck something at them, they get a chance to shoot back at you. And that's why, now we see standoff and those weapons that have got a bit more range, because once we brought in precision-guided weapons, which we did in the Gulf War, we literally brought them into service at that time, using the Buccaneer, if you remember. What that allowed us to do was get up to medium level, where there were a lot less guns and a lot less low-level SAMs. So now you're only having to face the big old SAMs, which were a little easier to avoid. And it gave you a little bit of standoff, because obviously a bomb flies a lot further. And because they were designed to sort of glide in a nice, gentle, aerodynamic way, you got 4, 5, 6, 7 miles, depending on your speed. So that allowed you to stay away from the target as well. So, that was the changeover point, wasn't it?
It was, I mean, and you're describing the sort of post-Cold War era because the end of the Cold War, suddenly we've sort of gotten involved in wars of choice rather than wars of national survival. And bluntly, we didn't pick a fight with people who are very credible. So you've described Iraq. They didn't have great air defense systems, and it was not that difficult to take them out. Afghanistan had nothing. Therefore, by operating outside the umbrella of the bullets, if you lay on your back with a pistol, how high would the bullet go? Generally, it won't go above 10,000 feet for any of small arms. Therefore, you operate above there. And now you've got a whole raft of different weapons that were introduced, weren't they? So things like Paveway 2 and had GPS guided munitions. You had a tiled pod. That pod, I don't know what targeting pod you had, but in the Harrier, you had a targeting pod and the bomb. And my goodness, were you busy, because trying to get this bomb into the air at the time when you knew you had the target locked up, then keep the target locked up. So you were self-designating. But of course, you didn't have to worry. So your head was completely inside the cockpit, but there was nothing going on outside to threaten you. Whereas I'd much prefer at that time to have been in a two-seater jet where you've got two of you sharing the load.
We had the same pod as you, tiled. I mean, thermal imaging and laser designator, if I remember rightly.
Oh, very
Always
good.
have to come up with a clever mnemonic. But it was good in that it used thermal imaging, so you could see targets, better between black and white hot on the ground, depending on what time of day you were dropping at. It couldn't see through cloud, so it still wasn't all weather. You still had to have good weather, so that was quite important. And then you're right, you just basically fired a laser dot at the target, and that reflected back, and the bomb saw that's the signal coming back from the laser, and then basically homed in on the signal. And you had to put a certain code in to make sure it saw your bomb and not somebody else's. And in theory, it was extremely accurate. We're talking tens of feet, if not less than that. And you're right, if the threat wasn't there, you could basically go around the target for a while, making sure you absolutely had the right target and absolutely knew what you were doing. And if it went wrong, you'd always go around and do it again. In a war, of course, that doesn't necessarily happen. So it's still exposing you to a threat.
No, and I think what was interesting, you're talking about battle damage assessment. We were able to do that instantly, and you could have, once you've got rid of your bombs, you now know the target area. You can use your designator for other people coming in, and actually it's just a question of coordinating the aircraft. But you said a low risk. What is interesting though is I think the £1,000 that I cut my teeth on, £2,000 or £3,000 a time. I was looking up the other day the paveway kits. It's 70k now for a paveway kit. In other words, something that puts straps on the front of the bomb that's got a sensor on the front of it, guidance pins on the back of it, and all of a sudden you've seen a almost 2 orders of magnitude of extra cost come in as a result of that. And of course, it was still a free-fall weapon. Whereas, and I think that's where we also just started to see drones come in, didn't we? But they were initially just doing, my bladder wouldn't last 24 hours observing a target in Afghanistan, whereas a Reaper would just go round and round and round collecting information and data. Then they started to arm them up as well. And I think that's, but of course nowadays, I'm still not entirely sure, before we leave the subject of drones, these one-way attack drones, which we weren't using at the time, and these standoff precision guided munitions, we were bantering a bit before. What is the difference between those two? It's not entirely clear to me.
Yeah. I think this is the big question that everyone needs to now answer. They're not new concepts. We had one-way attack drones in the Second World War, the Doodle bugs and the V1 rockets and kamikaze Japanese, aircraft. Those were all one-way attack drones, albeit some of them with humans in, designed to literally be used once and just crash into the target. And the beauty of that is, of course, is that it's going to get to the target and it's going to aim and point at the target right to the last minute. The problem is, and if you're the equivalent as a weapon dropped off an aircraft, it means you haven't got to put the aircraft in harm's way to drop it. So there's a saving there. The challenge, of course, is the cost benefit of the two. And if you need to send 100 one-way attack drones, but only 2 Storm Shadows, then it doesn't matter that the Storm Shadow costs you a lot of money. But I think now we're seeing that balance starting to go out of kilter. We're now seeing these one-way attack drones with a much greater range. They don't yet seem to have the penetration or the speed and therefore it's surprising that they're getting through to some of the targets that they are in Russia in particular. We see a lot shot down over Ukraine because Ukraine has got very good at doing that, and therefore there is only a 20% success rate, maybe less on some days. So they're not, they are far more likely to be intercepted. But I think the trick here is can the weapon manufacturers now get the balance right between the cost of precision and the cost of effect down to the point where the drone no longer becomes a cost-effective solution? And I think that's the challenge. But and I know that when we design these weapons, the GPS system is multiply protected from jamming, from interference signals. That adds cost. Now, I'm pretty sure a lot of these systems that are being used in Ukraine are using off-the-shelf GPS, which means they are jammable. And that's why we've seen fiber optics now arrive in the battlefield to try and get around that problem. So it's a constant battle and counter battle here of trying to negate each other's systems. So we're not done yet.
No, but you do raise an interesting point about. So I was at an event on Saturday in the club in London, and it was about drone manufacturers looking at how they support Ukraine. Had a fascinating brief from a Ukrainian who was a part of the drone attack system, sort of talking through what proportion actually get through, and it was a very small proportion. Interestingly, a lot of them are shot down by their own people because there isn't that sort of a coordination around. But there are a couple of companies now that have sprung up that are helping the Ukrainians, and they're building some of these weapons, not just drones, but sort of missiles as well, that are probably, if not 1/100th of the cost, certainly 1/10th of the cost as Western weapons. Now, what they're doing is they're not using state-of-the-art stuff, they're just bolting stuff together. But the big thing they don't have to do is go through all the safety and certification work. And that's making it a lot quicker and a lot cheaper. And I do wonder, when we look at, a lot of the weapons today are still largely a result of the legacy Cold War. They're free fall, you've got to go near the target. What's this next generation of weapons that we're going to invest in going to look like? We've invested a lot in our F-35s. We've invested a lot in all sorts of aircraft, but what sort of weapons do we now need to invest in? Is it cheap and cheerful, lots of them, so you overwhelm defences, or is it expensive, few, but you're going to run out of them very quickly?
Well, the tricky answer to your question, I'm going to slightly duck it, is a bit of both. It was a really good, fascinating vignette, I think just the other day, either yesterday or Saturday, which was a Ukrainian drone flying to the north of Moscow. It went to an area it hadn't been to before and struck an oil refinery. And there's a picture of the oil tank with literally a shadow of the drone where it's hit and a small leak coming out where it's obviously dented the outside metal. Because it just didn't have enough oomph, or it didn't go bang, one or the other, to penetrate what was effectively a relatively soft target. Now, if you fired a Storm Shadow or even a Paveway weapon or a Spear 3 against that type of target, it would obliterate it. It wouldn't just obliterate it, it would obliterate everything around it, because the weapon is designed to cause huge destruction. A lot of these drone weapons aren't yet either fast enough or carry enough of a load to have the same effect. They look spectacular, and against a softened target or a thin-skinned target like an aircraft sat on the ground, it can absolutely do the job. But if you're trying to take out a bunker, a command center, a logistics trail, a refinery, and you're trying to take it out to the point where you destroy it or keep it out of the game for, let's say, a week or a month, then you need these aircraft, these weapons that are going to penetrate and do the damage. And at the moment, the drones aren't able to do that. You mentioned one other thing as well, is about the rules and the risk. There's a thing called insensitive and sensitive munitions. We in the West buy insensitive munitions. Those are munitions that on the ground are very, very safe. It is really hard to make them go bang. You can set fire to them, you can send electronic signals into them, they just won't go bang. Hit them with a hammer, do whatever, they don't go bang. The ones that are being built in Ukraine could go bang in a heartbeat, and you have to handle them with care and get rid of them quite quickly, and you don't want to be sleeping next to them. Now, if you're going to start putting weapons like that in the magazine of your aircraft carrier, or in the middle of your airbase, then you need to think through the risk calculation of that. So getting the balance right here between risk and cost benefit of effect is the trick. Now, I happen to think it's going to be a blend, and I think it's just getting that blend right. And it may well be that some of the targets you and I used to spend more time worrying about close to the troops, doing close air support, are now the purview of a drone. There's just no reason to stick a manned aircraft in that space anymore. And so drones will become the dominant weapon type in terms of air in that airspace. But 200 miles, 1,000 miles behind the front line, I think the jury's still out. I think we are still looking at a Tempest carrying a relatively high number of high penetrating, high performing stealth weapons that can get through the air defense system, that can genuinely cause strategic damage, that causes an enemy to genuinely go, hang on a minute, I've taken on the wrong fight here, as opposed to an attritional war that lasts for years and doesn't necessarily bring the war to an end.
No, I think it's such a huge subject, isn't it? Because I think we started this by talking about tanks, and what part of my role was to take out tanks. But you delivered, what is it? The 755 had 147 bombs each of them. Yeah, there we go. Nearly beat me to it. But we need to have 4 or 5 of these bombs, nearly 1,000 bomblets, and most of them would not hit the target because you were hitting an area. Whereas a modern drone carrying one of the bomblets adapted that can go into the side of a tank very accurately. Is the tank, as you say, going to be a target set for us in the future? Probably not. And therefore, is the range of target sets going to be very different? And also, I was just having a quick look before. The Tomahawk was, being used very widely, £2 million a time. The joint air-to-surface standoff munition, £500,000 a missile. Even the Storm Shadow was £2 million a pop. And Spear is, I think, 100k a pop as well. There are huge amounts of money, and therefore I think you can't afford to have huge stockpiles of them. And therefore, do you just manufacture a few to be able to test and fly with occasionally and maybe just make sure they work, but keep the factory warm so that you can spin up when you need to and keep the latest technology spooled in there? And that will be a very different relationship between industry and the MOD. I don't know. What do you think? How do you think that relationship's got to mature?
Yeah, well, look, I think if you were to go through the history of weapons in the air, you'd start off with 1,000 bomber raid. How many bombs did you have to drop to achieve your aim? A lot, because they weren't accurate. You literally saturated the area, and one of them was going to succeed. Then, and even in the Second World War, you started getting more sophisticated. Dam busters is a classic example of one weapon in theory to try and, but as we know, that a lot of Lancasters were lost, taking out a number of dams. And then we slowly but surely moved into greater accuracy. Even in your and my day of dumb bombs, we were getting better at hitting the target. But precision weapons, it became one bomb, one target. And more importantly, the bomb had a 99.8% chance of going bang. So your chance of success was high. And we've now got to that world that we now want to try and occupy. And now the question is, and if you put monetary value, you're only looking at half the equation. You need to work out whether you're going to achieve the effect. If one Storm Shadow, and I remember them being £1 million at the time, but maybe inflation has taken them up to double that.
£2 billion for 1,000 missiles. That's how I remember it.
Okay. Well, yeah. Of course, you're paying for development and all that nonsense. But yeah, fair enough. If that's how the numbers work out. But if that takes out an enemy command and control bunker that's got a sophisticated and literally shuts down their network or shuts down their command and control, that is money well spent. Now, if you've got to do that with a cheap drone and fire 1,000 of them, and the 1,000 cost X, okay, now you can start doing a comparison. But the fact of the matter is, those drones can't do that type of an attack against a hardened target. So you do need to be very careful here about what are you attacking? How do you match the right weapon to that target? And I think the MOD does an awful lot of work on this. You know, and I know that a lot of our work when we were weapons instructor was weapon to target matching. Right, here's the target. Right, what's the best weapon? What's the best fuse? What's the best tactic? And that then arrived at a solution to take out that particular target. And that was what our bread and butter was. What we're now looking at is a strategic approach to how you do that to conduct a broad set of targets. And I think that's where the MOD is now going to have to do some difficult thinking. Those things that are better done by drones, park them. That's it. Right. Let's find what the right drone is. That's what will now happen. We'll now reserve our air power, our much more expensive and more sophisticated air power, for those types of targets that demand a more, a more capable way of taking it out. And if that is a Tempest in the future, or a Typhoon or an F-35 carrying a few smart weapons like a Spear 3, because if you can then take out his radar systems, his air defense radars, his command and control, his nuclear control facilities, and you now begin to take that capability down, and having that capability on day one is what deters an enemy from coming at you at the first place. So it isn't about using them, it's about the threat of their use that stops the other guy doing it back at you. That's what deterrence is.
Yeah, no, I get it. But the other part of this, for my sins, having been a sort of requirements manager on the Joint Strike Fighter for a couple of years, you also saw this conundrum that we have our own homemade weapons. And there is some advantage to that rather than buying off the shelf, because you can make sure you get what you need, and come the day, you can trust the weapons are going to do what they say they're going to do, and you can tweak them, evolve them as you do. But when you turn up to Lockheed Martin and say, right, I want to integrate this Paveway 4 onto the Joint Strike Fighter, they go, okay, well, there's a long list of other weapons that we're waiting to integrate. You'll have to wait 6 years. And by the way, I think the latest cost was £107 million to integrate that weapon onto the Joint Strike Fighter. And you go, okay, we are limited by money. Do we? I mean, one of the options is you just buy US weapons. They're a lot cheaper. They're already integrated. Or do we develop our own? What's your sort of sense of that, where that balance lies?
Yeah, this is a hugely frustrating area. I mean, we've tickled it a little bit in the past on some of our podcasts, and I've been at all ends of that particular debate about where the problems sometimes occur. They're more often than not the integration onto the aircraft, including the aerodynamics and the software, a lot of which is based on risk and ensuring that everything works perfectly. The idea that you go to a car dealer and buy a car, and as you sign your dotted line and hand over your check, the guy says, do you want wheels with that? And do you want steering wheel? And do you want some seats? And do you want a radio? I mean, you just wouldn't do it. But for some reason, we seem comfortable doing that with our weapon systems, and that cannot be right. Now, you know and I know that you can get around that by just waiting till it's all done and then buy them. But that would add, in the current world, 5+ years to the program before you even receive an aircraft that can do anything. We've always received the aircraft early and then integrated these bits and pieces on later. It's cunningly called spiral development. In my book, it's called late delivery, but there you go. We cannot afford that to happen. We can't because we can't afford to have an overlap of an old system whilst you've already got the new system. And we have done that so often in the past. And then we've run out of money. So we've had to let the old system go early, and the new system still hasn't got the capability. You know and I know that Typhoon took a long time to get the capability of the Harrier and the Tornado on its aircraft. And the F-35 is taking even longer. So, it's not how we do things on our mobile phone and IT at home. It all happens quicker these days. For some reason, in the world of aeroplanes, it's slowed down, and that's got to reverse.
No, it always strikes me a bit bizarre. It's like going out and buying yourself a pistol, but not having any ammunition for a few years. And you go, well, what are you going to do with the pistol? Throw it at somebody. I mean, it's got a very expensive, very capable platform like the Joint Strike Fighter, and indeed the Typhoon, can fight their way to the target. But unless you've got something to schwack the target to make the whole thing worthwhile, So I think in summary, where we are on the weapons, I think it does feel like the target sets are changing. It feels like a bit of standoff is going to be of value, and therefore, particularly for the aircraft, because you don't want to get any closer than you have to a target that's well defended, even if you have got stealth capability. And I think the jury's still out a bit on quantity versus quality. When you talked about drones, I read this week that Russia is now ramping up productions of the Shahed drone that it bought from Iran. It's now doing its own development of that. And their plan is to do 2,000 Shahed raids, i.e. 2,000 Shaheds in single raids. They've got a new black coating, makes them more difficult to see. They're also putting a little jet engine in them rather than propellers, so they're going to go faster. Yeah, they'll all get more expensive, but how on earth you configure your defences when 2,000 of these things are coming in a very short period of time? That creates a real problem.
I chuckled there. I remember when we painted all our training aircraft black because it made them easier to see. So maybe someone should do some research. I chuckled as well about your gun analogy. The pistols we used to fly with, I think they were more lethal when you threw them because they had better range when you chucked them. Yeah, look, the world is changing. There's no doubt about it. I was looking the other day. I mean, the sophistication now in Ukraine and Russia to look after your logistics train is by building net tunnels to drive through, because the threat has become the drone. Well, a Paveway 4 or Spear 3 doesn't care about a net. So if the next fight, everyone starts packing themselves with nets, they're going to be defending themselves from the wrong weapons. So this development has been an age-old thing. It's been going since the First World War, and it won't stop here. Ukraine is not the final answer to the problem, and we saw in Iran exactly how Israel handled that, and the US for that matter. And you're right. If people now see drones as a threat, they're going to start building underground bunkers again. They're going to start making sure that they're protected. They're going to disperse. They're going to do this, that, and the other. So the character of warfare will continue to evolve, and the weapons will have to evolve with it. But at the end of the day, it does come down to physics. And if your weapon has got greater range and greater penetration than your enemies, you're going to prevail.
There's a lot of work going on this, no doubt. And so to wrap up, that we've been regularly bantered about how do we balance, talking about military capability, inform the next stage, but also what's happening in the news. So we're going to have a little segment at the end of each of our podcasts, just things that we've picked up in the news in the last. So do you want to start? What you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, on the strategic political agenda, let's be big boys here. I mean, the Donald Trump Putin meeting in Alaska on Friday, I think all eyes are going to be on that. There's an awful lot of confusion about what has been agreed. What has Steve Witkoff said to Putin behind closed doors? What has Russia said to them? It doesn't look great, if I'm honest. I don't think Russia is yet. And I think this is the classic, isn't it? America has the opportunity to put more sanctions on Russia and really turn the handle. And it appears to not be doing so. Trump thinks he's going to find a way around this. I don't buy it personally. I think unless we really start to ratchet up the pressure on Russia and they genuinely realise that the game is up, Putin's going to keep stringing this along. And of course, we still don't even know if Zelensky's going to be involved in the talks. So that does not bode well. So who knows? Somebody could pull it out after the deal and all that, but I'm not optimistic.
It is interesting. I think the fact it's happening in Alaska, wasn't it? That America bought Alaska off the Russians, I think. So trading in land, and they happen to be meeting there. The one that caught my eye, you talked about survivability. I think a couple of podcasts ago we talked about agile, employment and how you actually survivability. I was struck by the Ukrainians with their F-16s. The Russians must be targeting them, trying to see where they're being based and blow them up at their home base. Well, sponsored by the Come Back Alive charity, Project 61, read about this week. And it's a whole series of vehicles that are tailor-made for the F-16. So they've got weapons, they've got turnaround facilities and everything available. And they literally take this little thing on the road so they can operate these F-16s almost wherever they want to go. It hasn't been very expensive. It's been a few million total. I don't know how they handle secure comms and all that sort of thing, and how you manage a package of aircraft, because we generally don't operate as onesie twosies. But I do think it's going to be interesting to see how Ukraine is probably leaning into this agile combat employment model even more than potentially we are. There are probably some lessons we can learn from that.
I think there's some huge lessons, and it is spectacular to watch them do what they do. The thing that's fascinating for me is, I mean, if you and I were fighting an air campaign as an air commander, we would be thinking about how much pressure can we apply, how many sorties can we fly, how many targets can we hit. We'd be looking to maximise our effort. Ukraine can't do that. It's not going to turn the war around in a day, a week, or a month with the use of its air power. It doesn't have enough. So it almost has to fight like a guerrilla would and strike at their point of choosing, in and out, not set patterns, which is exactly what they're doing by being able to disperse their aircraft. So for them, it's more about survivability. They want to have an air force intact at the end of this war, so that when peace comes, they've still got something left to be able to protect that peace. So yeah, it's a much more nuanced challenge in Ukraine than we might look at it through a similar lens. But I think it's not a bad lens for us to look at, because actually we will come under attack. If this did go wrong and Russia decides to really get nasty, it's going to hit targets that currently, we could argue are quite vulnerable. So how do you survive that? How do you avoid taking those losses? And how many times have we done research into whether it's Pearl Harbor or the 6-Day War, where, people were caught off guard and took huge losses and took a while to recover from them. So, there's some really good lessons from Ukraine about how to operate differently.
Good one. Well, thanks for your time, Greg. Until next time.
Thank you. Cheers, Sean.